Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 938th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Brooklyn Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation featuring Pepe Karmel and Joachim Pissarro. We are thrilled to welcome poet Shin Yu Pai here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Pepe Karmel is professor of art history at NYU. He is the author of Picasso and the Invention of Cubism, Abstract Art, A Global History, and of course, looking at Picasso. He has written widely on modern and contemporary art for museum catalogues and for publications, including the Brooklyn Rail. He has also curated or co-curated numerous exhibitions, most recently Dialogues with Picasso at Museo Picasso Málaga in 2020. Art historian, theoretician, curator, and educator Joachim Pissarro is director of the Hunter College Galleries and Bershad Professor of Art History at Hunter College. Pissarro has curated numerous exhibitions and is the author of many books, including most recently Wild Art with David Carrier. Pissarro is a consulting editor here at the Rail. So thrilled to have you both here in conversation today. And with that, I will pass it off to you, Joachim.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you very much. And welcome, Pepe, on this NSE program. And I, for one, am extremely grateful and eager to hear your comments on this very fascinating, deeply original, I find, personal in many ways, book on Picasso. But before we go into the proper Q&A answer, I think it's fair to allow our audience to have an idea about the book that that we are discussing. It's a very visual book, so I think Eleanor has prepared a small survey for us, and maybe you want to jump in, Pepe, at any point and help the audience guide through the flow of the book. Obviously, this is not going to do justice to the book, but it will give you a very brief sample idea of what is in store for you, and there are many surprises.
Sure thing. Thank you, Joachim, so much for hosting this, for being my interlocutor today, and Eleanor and everybody at the Rail. I'm very grateful to you for, making this possible. So this is a book my book that's just been published. That is an attempt to give an overview of Picasso's career in, just 200 pages, 100 and something pictures. In other words, not so much that you get lost in it, but enough to give you a good overview. So this is the cover, obviously. If we could go, Eleanor, to the next slide, please. So there's a brief introduction. The first chapter is a brief overview of Picasso's life, which I'm, evoking here by a relatively early self-portrait where he makes himself look like a movie star, and a very late self-portrait where he makes himself look like a kind of skull or death's head. The idea behind this book, as the title suggests, is to look at that's why it's called Looking at Picasso, not A Life of Picasso or Picasso Life and Art or one of those more obvious titles. But there is, of course, a certain amount you need to know about, where did he come from? How did his career advance? Who were the important people in his life? And that's all covered rather rapidly in this first chapter. If we could go to the second, please. Then, perhaps a little perversely, I've lumped together the first two or so periods of Picasso's career, the blue period and the rose period, into a first chapter on symbolism. The basic argument here being that, in a funny way, early Picasso is like a late 19th century artist. He's someone who's imbued with that ethos of the mysterious, things that are haunted, things that are veiled. And then at the end of this chapter, I make an argument which might be a little weird or provocative, which is that the Demoiselle d'Avignon, which, you know, we usually think of as the first breakthrough revolutionary modern painting, might also be considered as Picasso's last symbolist painting. That just as on the left, he's showing, you know, two women, probably prostitutes, sitting at a bar, drinking absinthe, trying to forget so they don't have to think about their lives. On the right, he's showing us a group of nude or semi-nude women in the waiting room of a brothel. That's the subject matter here. This was supposed to be one of two paintings giving a kind of panorama of modern life. The other one was going to be fancy people in the Bois de Boulogne. But then he decided to make the style more aggressive and revolutionary. And this, of course, is indeed what leads to Cubism, which is the next chapter. Eleanor, if we can go forward again. And here, you know, Cubism to me is probably the single most important event in 20th century art. And in my first book, 20 years ago, I tried to lay out how did it evolve? How did Picasso get there? How did it change after he began? But one thing that I think is often mistaken in histories of Cubism, including my own, including that book from 20 years ago, is that they all stop in 1914. So I'm showing you on the left kind of a classic Cubist picture from 1911, what we usually call analytic Cubism. But the fact is that Cubism keeps on going in Picasso's work. He keeps on inventing new styles of Cubism right up through 1924. And this very large painting on the right, Mandolin and Guitar in the Guggenheim, with its brilliant planes of color, its simplified shapes. There's no Cubist grid here to speak of. It's just one shape overlapping another. This, to me, is in many ways the absolute summit of Cubism. It's not, you know, a change, a falling off. It's the thing that the whole movement has been evolving towards. So I wanted to give some sense of that extended Cubism here in this chapter. So, Eleanor, if we can go forward again. Thank you. The next chapter deals with surrealism at Picasso, which in many ways is really an extension of Cubism. In a way, it's just not true that there's a break. Just Cubism turns into surrealism in his work. And it does so in the early and mid 1920s, before André Breton starts publishing manifestos about surrealism. There's much to be said about it. It's a long chapter. But the key point I want to make right now is that there are really two different currents within Picasso's surrealism. There's the biomorphic, body, rounded shape kind of cubism that you see on the left, the painter and his model, and then there's a strict geometric cubism, which again, you might also think of as an extension, surrealism, a geometric surrealism, which is what you see in the Monument to Apollinaire, which is in effect, a continuation of Cubism, although so is the kind of painting on the left. And here I want to express one idea from the book, which is that these paintings are often described as Picasso's monsters. And I don't think they're intended to be monstrous. I think what Picasso was trying to do here, and there are, you know, quotes and so forth from his statements to back this up, is to give you a sense of the human body, not the way an artist usually sees it, standing 10 or 15 feet away at the other side of a studio, but a sense of what the human body looks like or even feels like when you're a few inches away, when you're locked in an embrace, when it's extremely up close and personal and intimate, but somehow to convey the whole body, so that you might come into contact with a mouth, an eye, a breast, a foot, and so on, sequentially, and then Picasso wants to put those all back into one figure. Okay, let's keep going from there. Next, please, Eleanor. Thank you. Then, of course, there's his famous classicism or neoclassicism, and of course, what's very confusing is that he pursues this style, which is on wonderful display in the Fontainebleau show at the Museum of Modern Art right now, done by my wonderful colleague and friend Dan Umland. He pursues this classical style simultaneously with late Cubism and with surrealism. So early examples include paintings like these two-seated nudes, which seem to be inspired by murals, frescoes he'd seen in Pompeii. And then later on, you get this extraordinary suite of etchings, the Vollard suite, with classically images of the model and sculptor collaborating on making these wild, somewhat surrealist sculptures, but also images of the Minotaur, of sex and violence. So this is a long and very important part of Picasso's development. And then the last chapter, if we can go forward one more time. Honestly, this should have been 3 chapters. It really picks out, it starts in 1937 and goes all the way to the end of Picasso's life in 1973. But I ran out of words, honestly, and had to compress it all into 1 chapter. So on one hand, there are images, sculptures, and paintings like the one on the left done during World War II, where in a way Picasso comes back to the language of Cubism, but uses it to express the depression and the horror of wartime, which of course is something that seems all too relevant today with the events occurring in the world around us. There came an end finally to World War II, and hopefully we'll see some return to peace in a year or 2 or 3. And then Picasso turned to a kind of celebration of the everyday in paintings like The Kitchen. This is a highly abstract version of The Kitchen. He and his partner of those years, Francois Gillot, would sit at a table in the kitchen to eat dinner. So he decided to recreate this environment in a painting. And the book, the last chapter, in fact, goes up to the very end of his life. But these, I think, are 2 key examples of that later work. And that is it for my show and tell. Thanks, Eleanor.
Well, absolutely fascinating. Thank you for this brief but rich, dense, and alluring overview. And I think we should all rush and buy a copy. You're going to give us a link, or Eleanor will put a link.
I think Eleanor has one somewhere.
We should say a word, by the way, about the publisher, if you don't mind, who is none other than Thames and Hudson, who are really known for producing exquisite book. The present commissioner, Roger Thorpe, is a friend, but there's a long tradition. And yours is absolutely no exception. I must say, just glancing through the book, the quality of the images, the quality of the paper chosen, all this resonates very deeply with Picasso's ongoing, unstoppable, demiurgic creativity. So let's begin with where we are today, 2023, here at the Brooklyn Rail, celebrating the 50th anniversary, or commemorating rather, the departure of this giant, of this man whom Alfred Barr in 1939, Alfred Barr, not being prone to hyperbolic expressions, would call in the preface of the catalogue, of the first retrospective catalogue at MoMA, Picasso, not only did he call him a genius, but he said he's such a genius. This double hyperbolic or expressive hyperbolic is so. There's this kind of titanic view of who Picasso is today, 50 years after this momentum, his departure. There's an unfathomable number of events taking place. Just before the program began, you were reciting, Pepe, the number of exhibitions we have here in the city that are opening more or less this week. Is it five or six?
Something like that. I mean, there were 2 that were already open at museums and another 3 or 4 opening this week, including one that you've curated. So,
but so on the one hand, one could say what a perfect timeliness for the publication of this book. On the other hand, I would also like to turn to you and to say, look, I actually remember in the 80s or 90s going to a great collection in Madrid of a guy who collected Picasso, but who also collected books, as you clearly are yourself. We see from what's behind you, and who decided to enter the daunting task of creating a library, an exhaustive library of anything and everything that was published by Picasso. And it was 2 humongous library rooms, absolutely filled to the ceiling with books. And that was already 30 years ago. So I don't know what's the bibliography like? And I know you're making an attempt at the end of giving us a summary of that bibliography, but explain to us another book on Picasso. What can you add to this unfathomable, daunting bibliographical mass on Picasso?
Good question. Well, one thing that drove me to do this was a sense that there are, so many books about Picasso, one scarcely knows where to begin. If you found yourself in that collector's library, where would you start?
Right.
And looking for answers to that question, I realized that there wasn't really an up-to-date book that was a survey of Picasso's career, a small enough format that someone could actually read it. There are enormous volumes like The Ultimate Picasso, which was compiled by the curators at the Museo Picasso in Paris. And it's, 600 or 700 pages long, and it has 800 reproductions, and it's incredibly useful as a reference, but you're not going to sit down and read it from one end to the other. Then there are, a few, quick commercial overviews that have been slammed together to be sold in museum bookstores that don't go very deep. They repeat what we already know. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, it would be useful to have a book that's no more than 200 pages, roughly 100 images, and tries to summarize the new scholarship so that you'll get some idea. What if people, what new information, what new ideas have emerged about Picasso since 1980? But still that you could read, that you could pick up and read conveniently. And let me add that my last book, Abstract Art, which was also Thames and Hudson, and they did an incredibly beautiful job. But I didn't realize until I got the first copy exactly how big and heavy it was. And it is so big that if you dropped it and it fell on your foot, you'd have to go to the hospital. And more realistically, when you read it, you have to put it on a table. It's too heavy to read on your lap. So one of my goals for this book was to make a book you could sit comfortably on the sofa and read it on your lap.
Exactly. And
very scholarly.
You've achieved this beautifully. Let's look at your summary, because I mentioned this in a word, but I would like to, turn to you in more ways than one, and well, see whether you agree with what I'm proposing, which is I see this as being not just looking at Picasso, but it's really Pepe Karmel looking at Picasso, inviting us to go on this gazing journey through your eyes. It's a very personal book in many ways. It resonates, provocative. You use that word too. We'll go into this in a moment. But at the end of your great introduction, you quote someone who seems important to you, close to you. He's no longer there. Carl Einstein, one of the great critics on Picasso, one of the great commentators. You also call him a bad writer, but you seem to like him nonetheless. And you end with this quote: Picasso is a signal of how much freedom this age could possess. And I think that's so beautifully said. I did not know that quote, but can you expand with us on why you chose this quote?
So one of the things that Einstein points out is that Picasso didn't accept reality as he found it, that he wasn't someone who passively records appearances. Whatever he saw in the world, he took it apart, he reinvented it. As Einstein says in the same passage, he injected masses of imagination into reality. And so he was constantly taking it apart and putting it back together in his own way, in different ways. There's no one Picasso style. Famously, there are many, many styles. He used to claim that when he got up in the morning, he didn't know what kind of painting he was going to make. I don't completely believe that, but it's a lovely idea. But that freedom to reinvent, that refusal to be bound by existing reality, seems to me a powerful allegory of how we need to look at the world. So much of, and here I'm in a sense expanding it as a political allegory to say that we can't just accept the world as it is. There are too many things that are wrong with the world. And we need imagination to understand that it could be different, and maybe we can, each in our different way, make it different. That's why here we are in the new social environment. And so for me, his work, beyond the particular subject of this painting or that sculpture, his work is a massive allegory of the possibility of changing the world, of remaking the world.
Yeah, fascinating. I wanted to ask you about another personal approach to the book. You went through some of it as we went through your very nice survey. But if I read, let me just quickly give you a 2-second literally survey list of your chapters: life, symbolism, cubism, surrealism, classicism, war and peace. And okay, so we could expand on every single one of them. We cannot do that within the short time we have. But let me ask you 2 questions that sort of resonated to me, having had as a first professor in graduate school at the Courtauld, John Golding, who gave us a fairly was a wonderful, incredible guy and one of the great early pioneering post-war art historians on Picasso. I don't think he would have ever put classicism after surrealism, for instance. Would you agree with that? I mean, so
probably not. It's an unusual thing to do.
It's an unusual thing to do. So would you kindly run us through this? I mean, how do you see classicism come after surrealism, even from a chronology?
So in reality, and I mean, there's no objectively right way to discuss Picasso's work. In reality, the two coexist. They're interwoven. I mean, Picasso actually starts making, he begins as a realist, then he does Cubism, and he starts making realist drawings again in spring 1914, supposedly in the middle of Cubism. And in fact, there's a wonderful letter he sends to his art dealer, Kahnweiler, with a few of these realist drawings. And he says, well, I've been doing these realist drawings, and even if this whole Cubist thing was a mistake, at least I've learned to draw better as a result. And when I first read that, I thought, even if this whole Cubist thing was a mistake, good God, man, you've just revolutionized modern art, and you're willing to say it might have been a mistake. But I'm not answering your question, Joachim.
No, but it's very but to the point. Yeah, no, I love what you're saying.
One of the problems with discussing his classicism coherently is that it really falls into 2 phases. He seriously begins making realist drawings in around 1919, and then there's a clear evolution within them up to about 1924, 1925. And then there's a kind of hiatus. I mean, he does some realist prints, but it's not a big part of his work. And then he picks up again in the 1930s, mostly in the medium of etching rather than painting or sculpture, and makes this extraordinary series of classicizing prints, the Volard suite. I just showed one, but there's dozens and dozens of them. And, I thought, should I do the early phase and then go to surrealism and then come back to classicism? And I felt, just as a matter of exposition, that it would make more sense. It would be understanding the classicism would be more comprehensible by keeping it together, because there is a continuity. And also that I wanted to trace its formal development. There's a tendency to discuss those classical drawings and paintings as if they were simply realistic. They're not. They're really not realistic at all. They're works of the imagination and invention just as much as Cubism or surrealism. And so I wanted to focus on that.
Mm-hmm. And that is very much in keeping with what Picasso tells us. He in the text precisely in 1923, which is reproduced in the Bar catalogue of 1939, Picasso is sort of defends himself. One can sense that he's been annoyed by so this text is written in the middle of the so-called classical period or purist period, whatever we want to call it. And he says, people are accusing me of never having gone beyond Cubism. That may be so, but in fact, this is an irrelevant question, because Cubism, if it ever ceases to exist, will recreate another form of art that will be a different form of Cubism. And so it's a way to say, I'm still in the Cubist mode, and you argue this very beautifully during your surrealist chapter. And in a sense, one could say that he never ceased to be a Cubist, didn't want to cease being a Cubist, never ceased being a classical artist as well. And the two contradict each other, and at the same time are inseparable from each other. That's how I see it. Picasso is bigger than history in a way. There's a sentence by Gert Schiff, who says the truth is that all throughout his career, Picasso was ahead of his audience by just one period. And I sense that this is kind of what you play with. You're not following a traditional chronological, and that to me is is bound to fail when it comes to Picasso, because indeed he meanders through so many different paths. But you've really kind of segmented his life and art approach into several blocks that have a very cohesive strength, each one of them.
Thank you. Well, that was very much my goal. Indeed, if you go through Picasso chronologically, it's so confusing. He does this, and then in the afternoon, he does something else, and the next day, he does something different from that. And you lose all sense of continuity. And there is, in fact, an evolutionary logic to his work. And by isolating these different styles, the Cubist, the Surrealist, the Classicist, I wanted to make clear the evolution within each of them, which is not visible in the day-to-day record.
Right. So you start, and we should talk about that because I've never seen anyone not speak about Picasso's life as we have approached his work. You start with a chapter on his life, but you start with a very provocative, and I find very stimulating, very interesting question, which is that you say that with so many artists, the life factor drives the art. Well, with Picasso, it's the other way around. The art drives the life. I'm very convinced by what you're saying, but can you unpack this for our audience in a quick way, if you in a summary way?
Well, I'm responding there to a famous statement by John Richardson, the great biographer who I knew and admired, and I've relied constantly on his books for information. But as a biographer, John obviously held to the theory that the life drove the art, and that when you looked at any given painting or sculpture or print, you should be asking which of his friends, which of his girlfriends, which of his wives is this related to, and that the meaning of that work could ultimately be traced back to some episode in his life. Well, as early as 1980, the critic Rosalind Krauss, I mean, I have to put in a note here. I've spent much of my professional career arguing with Rosalind Krauss about many different topics, but this is one place where I think she was absolutely right. This biographical approach to interpreting Picasso started around 1980 after Bill Rubin's big Picasso retrospective at the Modern, and it's quite striking. If you go back and read Picasso criticism written before 1980, there's almost no biography in it. I mean, if you read Robert Rosenblum on the Anatomies of Eroticism, or Gerrit Schiff in, there's a nice volume that Gerrit Schiff, who's one of my teachers in graduate school, there's a volume he edited with a bunch of essays, including his own. Almost nothing about Picasso's life, just, basic, was born, moved here, went there. The way people have spoken about Picasso for the last 40 years, just constantly saying, oh, yes, well, this is about him and Marie-Thérèse Walter, and this is about him and Dora Maar, or him and Olga Picasso, is completely missing from the earlier work. And I feel that it's become a distraction. There's a great deal to be learned from it, but, we need to get back to looking at the work. And furthermore, to come back to what the passage you quoted, does in fact seem to be that often the work anticipates the life. So, one of the most dramatic and indeed scandalous episodes in his life is his meeting with Marie-Thérèse Walter around 1927, and it's pretty outrageous. He's walking down the street and he spots this 17-year-old and picks her up and announces, I am Picasso. We are going to do great things together. And she goes, creepy old man, who are you? And he takes her to a bookstore and shows her a book about his work to convince her that he's not just making this up. But he is kind of a creepy old man by contrast. I mean, he was only 40 or something, but still. So, there's a huge literature about this, and much of the current controversy around Picasso, was he, a Me Too kind of abuser of women, centers on this episode and on things related to it or its aftermath. What isn't often discussed is that the image of a pure, innocent young woman starts appearing in his work 2 years before that. So I think you kind of have to ask, well, why did he do this weird, creepy encounter, which turned out so well, both for art and in many ways for life, for both of them? Why? And I think it's not just, middle-aged crisis. It's also that he had been dreaming of. He had been imagining a certain kind of youth and purity in his work. And then he saw someone like that in real life. It's like an episode from André Breton and Surrealism. You dream something and you're walking down the street and then you see it. And it seems to me that that happens repeatedly in his work, that his work, in fact, signals where he's going to go in life as well as work.
Right. And that's glad you brought up Breton, and you could think of Nadja and numerous examples of cinema as well. And this is the crossover, the cross-insemination, no bad pun intended, between surrealism and classicism. Your two chapters there is very vibrant. Yeah. Well, I just, yeah, that's very interesting. Since you brought up the eternal, there was somebody who posted a comment I just saw on the chat. I did not see the name, but I like the comment a lot. I want to salute that person, whoever they are, and welcome them after this, perhaps to ask Pepe questions or myself. And it says, the confusion lies with the art historians, not with the artists. I love that, and I think that's absolutely ever so true. And I would say, especially with Picasso and Karmel, to his credit now, is really trying, I don't know whether we should call it a new model, but definitely a new approach, a new trajectory to try to not to fall, let's say, in a double negative, not to fall into the trap of artistry in the traditional sense and being rigorously tied to chronology and so on. But another thing that I find provocative and interesting, I dare say, that's one of the many things I learned in your book. There's this also sort of preemptively provocative, yes, moment where you describe his move from the Bateau Lavoir. So we're talking about the first decade of Picasso being in Paris. He's in a kind of, isn't this romantic, he has very little money. He lives on Montmartre, where artists with equally little economic means would congregate, and they form this community. Difficult to imagine that today. Bateau Lavoir, which is one of the chicest parts of Paris, but nonetheless, in those days, this was very different. And so he moves from there to closer to the center of town. It's definitely not the 8th or the 16th of very elegant parts of Paris. It's still moderately lower middle class, but it's an apartment, a proper apartment, as opposed to sort of house with different artists living there. And there you describe the way he, according to Fernand Olivier, his first major partner, that way suddenly his entire ethos, his entire mode of living is transformed. He insists he lives, is served meals on a mahogany table with a maid or maids dressed in aprons, and some of the workers working with him say, wow, this guy must have hit the jackpot or something. Usually that episode in the economic history of Picasso is ascribed to Olga, somebody dear to me, but we're talking about the 1920s, when he's by then a celebrity, represented by not one, but two of the top art dealers worldwide. But we're 15 years ahead of that. And so how do you comment the fact that so early on, very far from his life with Olga yet, he's already beginning to display what you might call the bourgeoisie syndromes and an appetite for comfort and money?
Well, that's a really great question. And I mean, one simple answer, this doesn't explain the maids with the white aprons, but the move to the new apartment. I mean, life in the Bateau Lavoir was pretty terrible. It was, they were drafty studios. And I mean, he and Fernand Olivier lived a life of kind of miserable poverty. She has another wonderful description of how they very largely lived on oysters, which of course to us sounds like a luxury life. But in those days, oysters were pretty much the cheapest food you could eat. I mean, when you went into a bar in Paris or New York in 1905 and ordered a beer, they gave you a plate of oysters to go with it for free because they were so damn cheap. The world has declined since then. We went from oysters to salted peanuts to little pretzels. But anyway, Olivier describes how Picasso would just eat the oysters to stay alive and throw the shells on the floor, so that when you came into his studio in the Bateau Lavoir, there was a kind of pathway through the shelves it branched in one direction to the easel and the other direction to the bed, and you couldn't really walk on the rest of the floor. So this was a complete mess. And I think his father had aspired to a kind of middle-class, bourgeois, decent life. You can now visit, the house he was born in Malaga, the house where he spent his early teenage years in A Coruña in northwestern Spain, and so forth. And you can see that they were trying to be bourgeois. They struggled. His father didn't make much money. He was an art teacher, but that was what they wanted. The rest of the family helped them out. So it seems to me not so terribly surprising that he wanted to have, some degree of comfort, decent furniture, and so forth. Now, the maids, the bowing and scraping, I don't know. Maybe I think it was a kind of an ironic joke. And many years later, in the 1950s, Picasso said he had always wanted to live like a poor man in a rich man's house. He would buy a 17th century chateau to live in, and then he and Francois Gillot would camp out in the kitchen and, make pasta or something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you talk about provocation several times yourself. In a sense, you're walking in Picasso's footsteps. But yes, he is very much an artiste provocateur, I feel, through and through. We can't, the sort of the Himalaya that stands in the career of Picasso is, of course, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. You hinted at that. It's interesting that you put it not as part where it is usually placed in traditional historiographs or histories of Picasso as the beginning of or the preamble of Cubism, but you, I think, very convincingly argued for the fact, and you said somewhere, that it was conceived within the comfort zone of the pink period. And it's chronologically absolutely irrefutable, but I think it's interesting that you established that link with the pink period. This said, what you said to me is the other part that is extremely interesting and surprising, but having been at MoMA, you're again spot on, and that is that basically the Demoiselles d'Avignon is conspicuously missing in the early part of the history of art of Picasso. That you point out, I did not know that, but I'm not surprised, that the first retrospective of Picasso, which is not at MoMA, but in Paris and Zurich in 1932, the Demoiselles d'Avignon is not featured there. And why is that? Because it was rolled up in his studio, and not many people, or it was in Doucet's. Okay, it was in Doucet's collection at that stage. So Barr brings it up in 1939. It is there that it acquires its first limelight, and soon enough it is acquired. It becomes part of the collection of MoMA. MoMA having in the depth of the depression of the 30s not enough money to buy it, and having had to deaccession 3 paintings from the Lily Bliss collection. I just love that because the detail is fascinating. 1 Pissarro, 1 Degas racehorse painting, and 1 Renoir of the Guernsey period. Those 3 put the money forward to buy the Demoiselles d'Avignon. Can you imagine today this equation? Absolutely impossible. But anyway, my point is that what you say is that basically for the first 30 years of his life, Picasso's, let's say more than 25, a quarter of a century, the Demoiselles d'Avignon doesn't exist, or barely exists. And how do you reconcile these two facets? Today, nobody will go to MoMA. This is described as the most important work of the 20th century, the pinnacle of modernism. How do you put those two things together?
That's a great question. And I think it can only be answered by referring to another painting, which is much less well known in the United States, which is The Three Women of 1908, which to me is the first Cubist painting. It's at or near the beginning of my Cubism chapter. But it's not well known here because although it was owned by the Steins, by Gertrude and Leo Stein from 1908 when it was painted up through 1913, it was then, thank you, yes, exactly, that one, It was then sold to Sergei Shukin, the great Russian collector, and so it left, mainstream Europe. And then there was the Russian Revolution, and after a few years, the communist government decided they didn't like this kind of thing, so nobody saw it for decades and decades. So part of what happened was that in the absence of the three women, I mean, you can follow the evolution from the three women into Cubism seamlessly. But in its absence, the closest thing to a first Cubist painting was the Demoiselle d'Avignon. That doesn't answer the question of why it wasn't exhibited in 1932, presumably.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah, no, thank you for clarifying this. Yes, I see.
But presumably Picasso could have asked Jacques Doucet to lend it to the exhibition, but I think it had a contested status, even for Picasso himself, even in his circle. It's often said that it wasn't successful, nobody bought it, it wasn't exhibited until except very briefly in 1916, because it was so radical. But I don't think that's the reason. If you go back and you read, for instance, what Kahnweiler says about it in 1916, in his first book on Cubism, Kahnweiler says it was a titanic, incredibly ambitious attempt to rethink everything in painting, but it didn't really fit together. It had elements that were inconsistent. There are the passages that are kind of like Greek vase, the figures on archaic Greek vases, and then there are elements that come from African art and mishmash of other things. And Kahnweiler's perspective, and I think that of other viewers, was, okay, Pablo, this is an amazing set of ambitious ideas, but it doesn't hang together. Whereas the three women is really, really consistent. Now, you can regard that incoherence as a virtue. And for instance, Leo Steinberg, maybe the greatest Picasso critic, along with Alfred Barr, argued that not lack of homogeneity was a virtue, that's what made it such a great painting. And maybe that's true. But in its time, I think that was regarded as a defect.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned several times the question of inconsistencies, and there's no question that at the time this would be seen as revolutionary is a simple term, but bizarre, unacceptable, out of the box for sure. I remember during the Matisse Picasso show, so a colleague, Gary Garros, who was the chief curator of drawings, said together, you remember, the exhibition was at Queen's at the time because MoMA was closed, and one of the first paintings you would see would be Les Demoiselles. Gary said something very interesting and provocative. He said, imagine today this painting coming up for acquisition to a board of trustees at MoMA, and we don't know who that is. The artist totally unknown, anonymous painting. He said it would be such a jolt to the system. It would be so incomprehensible, even today. Today was then 2003, 2004. It might have been even rejected. He said something like that. It would be just impossible to grasp. And I don't, this was obviously a bit of a provocation on Gary's part, but there is something to it which goes to what you're describing here with these oddities and inconsistencies. I mean, it is such a startling painting to look at when you face it.
Now I'm going to tell a story out of school, and I'm probably breaching the non-disclosure agreement that I signed back when I was a curator. I don't remember signing it, so I'll just pretend it didn't happen. But indeed, when I was a curator, Rob Storr brought in a Philip Pearlstein, a magnificent, extraordinary Philip Pearlstein that, unusually for Pearlstein, had a big unfinished section. Part of it just blank. And in the committee meeting, Rob had to, who is amazingly articulate, just wizard of words, had to work really hard to convince the committee to buy it, because a lot of people felt, but it's not finished. Why should we pay for a painting that's not finished? I think that's the response the Demoiselle would have gotten.
Yeah, no, definitely. You brought in Strukin, and that's, if you don't mind my segueing on this, I wanted to bring together, bring Russia at large.
Yes.
Or let's say the Russian-speaking world within, because USSR is not Russia. The relationship of Picasso with the Russian world is for sure another very complicated as they would say, the metaphor often used in French, a basket full of crabs. You thrust your hands in it to see which one will bite you first. And so, he was married twice in his life, Olga and Jacqueline. So married to a white Russian family, meaning descendant, daughter of an officer in the Tsar's army, people who were during the USSR cast aside, marginalized. With Bernard Picasso and I published some of the letters which are absolutely gripping. Then move forward, 1946, 44 to be precise, at the end of World War II, he signs and becomes a member of the Communist Party. It's not alone. Léger, a number of people, the communists having been allies of the United States, we forget that, against Nazi Germany. Soon that turns over after World War II, but Picasso remains a very staunch, loyal Communist Party member. And when Stalin dies in 1953, you mentioned this as well, his relationship with socialist realism, which is the furthest thing on earth he could be compared to, he produces this kind of strange, this portrait of Stalin. I wish we had an image of it which is published on the cover of L'Humanité, the daily communist newspaper in Paris, and it creates a scandal. But the Russians don't quite, or the Soviet authority, or the Soviet world doesn't quite know what to do with it, because Picasso enjoys this world prestige, and soon after he's invited to the Pushkin, and he's invited to have not one but actually several exhibitions, I believe, in the Soviet world. And Picasso lives this contradiction, this popularity, unpopularity mixed with scandal, very unhappily. I think he is not at all pleased with the reception he has from the place whose party he has joined. And I wanted, and having had, first of all, a wife who's dying, who was completely from the other side. So you see the incredibly complex personal and political, you started talking about the political world, political sentiments that Picasso must have packed in regarding the Russian-speaking world at the time.
Talk about. Yes, well, I feel, let's give credit where credit is due, which is to you. You and Bernard did that extraordinary exhibition and catalog on the Olga period. And if I weren't going to give myself neck strain, it's somewhere on a shelf right behind me. I'd hold it up to the camera. But that was a moment in the early history of the Soviet Union, right after the revolution, between the new economic policies and also the Civil War. Russia and the Soviet Union were plunged into miserable poverty and economic chaos. And Olga's family back home, in the ones who remained in Russia, as you've documented, were just living from hand to mouth. And, Picasso sent them as much money as he could afford to help them stay alive. It was a terrible moment. But that was not the end of the story of the Soviet Union. Starting in the late 1920s and going through the 1930s, Russia has this strange double identity of horrific political repression and the mass starvation in Ukraine, but also extraordinary economic development. The image of communism changes. Joachim, we don't have your audio.
Because I suddenly have construction work, I was trying to get us to. Sorry, I didn't want to.
That's inevitable. A very loud truck is about to go by here, I'm sure. The whole image of the Soviet Union, Stalin was pretty effective at hiding the evidence of the mass deaths, the show trials and everything. People reported them, but no one believed it. As you know as well as I, there were, debates on the French left. Is this true or not? Maybe the trials were just a figment of the right-wing press trying to defame Russia. But there was, I think, overall a very positive view of it. And then, as you pointed out, during the war, it was the communists who most ardently defended, fought back against Nazism. And and who seemed to be on the right side, trying to bring in social welfare and other things in France and Italy and so forth after World War II. So they had a very positive image. I mean, it's a different reality. But then it changes again. I mean, not only does Picasso have the personal humiliation of that portrait of Stalin that gets condemned. I mean, the editors of the newspaper, the L'Humanité, were compelled to ask all of Picasso's friends and supporters to sign a letter denouncing him. And then each one of them came up to him separately and said, you know, Pablo, I didn't really mean that. You know, I had to do it for the party, but I didn't really mean it. But he was like, okay, yeah, I get that. I understand that. But then in 1956, when there was the rebellion in Hungary, and the Soviet Union sent in troops to crush this democratic rebellion, that really upset him. And Pierre Dax, who we know as a great Picasso scholar, but who was originally an editor of the communist newspaper and was one of the liaisons between the party and Picasso in the 50s, reports a conversation where he goes for a walk with Picasso after the Hungarian episode, and Picasso says, you know, I don't mind that the party leaders don't understand art. That, you know, it's not their job. But I hoped at least they understood politics.
Yeah, that would be a perfect way to close. I know we're close to the end, and just want to look at maybe briefly the last chapter of your book. You did say yourself earlier on in the summary that you ran out of words, a little bit like Rob Stoll trying to discuss the posting, and one is necessarily running out of words when talking about Picasso. So let me just, I'm not going to mention the fact that yes, there's a big discrepancy between the number of images up to 1948 and after 1948. It seems to me that there's a second book in the coming. So I don't know, maybe we should already program another NSE with Professor Karmel. But what I find interesting in your, another sort of provocative and deeply, I'd never thought about that, but it's very, let me read, you push the sort of post-war Picasso towards conceptualism. At least that's how I see it. You said painting, this is a quote from Picasso, painting is an equivalent of nature. Really? It is just a matter of signs. It has been agreed that this sign represents a tree, this other one a house, a man, a woman. Just as in language, the word man evokes the image of a man in our minds, the word house, a house, and so on and so forth in every language, although it is a different word in every language. Now, who said that first? Ferdinand de Saussure in 1905, the great-grandfather of linguistics, the great-grandfather of structuralism, and so on. And somebody who had a deep-seated foundation in the birth of conceptualism, so Louis, Kossuth, etc., etc. And I never thought so much about this, but as you pointed out, there's something that I might want to call the semiotization of the real that takes place in the last decades of Picasso, maybe throughout his entire career, I could say. But I wanted to hear you, first of all, if I am forcing out an interpretation that's not yours, but if not, if we're more or less in agreement, what do you make out of this kind of pre-science Picasso, conceptual before the conceptuals?
As usual, Joachim, you're precisely on target. And in fact, I feel like this is a plug for my next book or my next exhibition catalog. I just published an essay written since the book on signs and symbols, and Picasso with that text as a point of departure and looking at his engagement with linguistics and the idea of the sign. And I do think it's tremendously important, and that indeed the rise of structuralism, you know, from Saussure, Lévi-Strauss, and Roland Barthes, and all those people, you know, we grew up admiring so much, that is in part impelled by Picasso's engagement with the idea of the sign. So that when there's a structuralist interpretation of Picasso's work in the 1980s and the 90s, it's actually inspired by things that Picasso has said, as well as by things that Kahnweiler said. How thoroughly he carries that through is an interesting question. In some cases, what strikes me in the prints and paintings of the moment in which he says that, which is basically 1945 to 1949, that's what he talks a lot about signs, is that he's not moving towards a sign in a Saussurean sense, where there's an arbitrary sign and the written out word MAN signifies a human being. HORSE signifies a horse. These are the examples in Saussure.
Mm-hmm.
It's moving towards, in fact, it's a kind of return to symbolism, towards a symbol, towards shapes, dots and lines that look like they should be signs, that look like they might be Chinese ideographs, but don't actually refer to anything in particular. And I mean, this strikes me as the kind of thing that Roland Barthes would have written beautifully about. There's a kind of giant, sense of possibility, a universe of signs that don't mean anything in particular, but seem infinitely meaningful.
Very fascinating. Yeah, yeah. Well, Eleanor, you heard it. There is a room for another book coming, and we should plan for this if the audience, of course, approves.
I'm hoping to make up for the brevity of the last chapter, if possible, by organizing an exhibition about Picasso's work of the 20 years after World War II. So yes, indeed, hopefully we'll be back here in a few years to discuss that.
Okay.
In the meantime, my guess is there are probably some questions for us.
Yeah, I saw the signs. I mean, of course, there are many other things to say about this very rich, not super large, but deeply dense packed in with information and gorgeous images. So thank you, Professor Karmel, for coming with us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Joachim and Pepe, for the amazing conversation. And again, congratulations on the incredible book. We do have some questions from the audience today, and the first one I will ask on behalf of Donald in the audience. Donald asks, you mentioned John Richardson. Where does the biography by Pierre Caban fit in the literature? Thank you.
It's one in a series of great biographies. I'm trying to remember. I mean, there are some sort of oddball short biographies in the 30s, but after the war, there's one by Antonina Valentin. Caban does the first really major multi-volume biography, which is superb. They tend to, Caban's, later Pierre Dex's, Roland Penrose's biography is incredibly important, roughly contemporary with Caban's. They tend to really be histories of the evolution of the work with a little bit of life around them. Richardson's book is absolutely unprecedented in the depth of research. I mean, as I said to Richardson when the first volume came out, he not only answered questions to which I didn't know the answer, he asked questions so I didn't even know there was stuff to be found out. He opened up whole new territories of biographical research. And Caban does a wonderful job of linking life and work, but is not, obsessively tracking down every single person that Picasso ever met.
Right. Richardson lived with Picasso. I mean, not only as a young man, but you went to his incredible place here, and it was just like you felt Picasso was around. It was absolutely unbelievable.
Oh, I see someone is posing a question about Gertrude Stein's book, which is wonderful, but not really a biography. It's her reflections, some of which are absolutely priceless, but it's not a conventional biography.
And you say something about in your book about the Steins. You say that they're Tuesday evenings, I forget the day of the week when they would have these evenings, was a very important factor in disseminating the influence of Braque and Picasso during the Cubist years. Is that?
Absolutely. I mean, coming back to the three women, that painting, which actually began to influence other people, it pushed Braque and Derain towards some form of Cubism before it was even finished. They bought it and it hung somewhere in their house. Strangely enough, it was never photographed. We have photographs of Gertrude Stein's studies with other Picassos and Matisses and Cézannes. There's no photograph of the three women in the Stein house, but we know it was there. And we can also see its influence. The American artist Morgan Russell did a drawing after it on one of his visits to their apartment. And then that is really the starting point for his amazing synchronist painting, where he takes it towards pure abstraction.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that response. And thanks, Donald, for the question. Our next question is from John. And John, you should be able to unmute.
Okay, thank you. Great discussion. I look forward to reading the book. My question is, with such immense productivity lifelong, who managed the archive and kept track of the studio transactions? Who, did he do hiring? What was the everyday situation in the studio?
That's a really great question. One answer is that he had a series of dealers who kept track of things. He would, give them or sell them the paintings, and then their archives are open to a greater or lesser degree, mostly lesser. But also, when his life was in crisis in the 1930s, he asked a friend of his, Jaime Sabartes, to come back, I think, from South America and serve as his personal secretary and to kind of keep track of things, just as you're asking. Sabartes was supplanted by François Gillot to some extent when they were living together. And then later, towards the end of his life, Jacqueline Roque, who became Jacqueline Picasso, took on the immense responsibility of managing his life, which was a huge amount of work.
Did Dora Maar also participate in that way?
I don't think so. I think that she helped him with specific projects like finding the studio where he painted Guernica. She actually painted part of Guernica. In some cases, he said, here's the pattern I want in this area. Can you just do some more of that? And of course, she photographed it in development, but I don't think that she acted as a manager organizer.
Thank you.
Joachim, maybe you have something to add to this.
It's funny that you mentioned Dora Maar. I would say, and I don't know whether you agree, Pepe, but among all the mostly well-known companions, wives or non-unmarried companions he had, Dora Maar, to me, is the one who stood out and whom he felt who was able to challenge him. François Gillot always used to say, "I'm the only one who survived and who did not, die after him or committed suicide." That is absolutely true. She left us only a few weeks ago, an amazing lady. But Dora Maar, there was an exhibition organized by Anne Baldessari when she was director of the Museo Picasso in Paris, where she put together Dora Maar and Picasso's work at the same time when we knew they were collaborating. And it is very clear, the late 30s, that Picasso has a tough challenge ahead of him to even keep up with Dora Maar's unbelievable creativity as a photographer, among other things. She really was something else.
Yes. So let's say there are two tracks. There's the track of artistic partnership or artistic dialogue, and then the track of everyday life, John, which you asked about.
Right.
That one, I think Dora Maar was a great sparring partner in art, but not so much in everyday life.
Awesome. Thank you for that question, John. Our final audience question today is going to be from Phyllis. And Phyllis, you should be able to unmute.
Both of you were fantastic. This was very, very compelling. And Pepe, your definition of the classical period as not being realistic, I think this is the first time I have heard.
Yeah.
So my question is, was it a coincidence that the first neoclassical drawing was of poet Max Jacob?
No, I mean, well, it depends what you mean by coincidence. That's a great question. Thank you, Phyllis. But in fact, around that time, Picasso does a series, as you know, drawing portraits of Max Jacob, also of Ambroise Vollard, that are very clearly references to Ingres' portraits. So those wonderful pencil portraits that Ingres made in Rome when he was a student there. And, that was how Ingres helped support himself, was by doing pencil portraits and occasionally painted portraits. So there, Picasso is very much saying, okay, I'm going to go back and think about Ingres. But it's again, because as I discuss in the book, already in the blue and rose periods, there are quotations of Ingres, figures from his paintings that get paraphrased in Picasso's paintings. There's a early Cubist version of the Grand Odalisque that's in one of his notebooks from 1907, 1908. And just yesterday, at the opening of the Picasso sketchbook show at Pace, I saw yet another paraphrase of the Grand Odalisque in a kind of classical style from the 1920s. So, yeah, an obsessive concern. But as for Jacob was one of Picasso's absolutely closest friends at the time. And so the depiction of this dear, dear friend was much like Ingres' depictions of his friends from Rome. Joachim?
No, I guess I love what you're saying. You know that I agree, Phyllis. Thank you for such a brilliant question, and I happen to think that you're spot on, and it's true. I never heard until Pepe anyone raised that point. But again, this text that I keep referring to because I just read it, of 1923, reproduced in Barr's catalog in 1939. Picasso, you should read it. I'll post it, Eleanor, for everyone to read it. It's an amazing text. And in this text, he does exactly what you're saying, Phyllis, and he gives he justifies Pepe Karmel's point by saying, Ingres is not a realist. Ingres paints with his own vision, his own standpoint, his own perspective, and he's no more realist than I am, kind of, and he's using then another stronger example. He says, look, Velázquez painted Philip II, and so did Rubens. And you see, look at the two portraits, one by Velázquez, one by the Rubens. They look like two utterly different individuals, because the Philip II of Rubens and the Philip II of Velázquez have nothing to do with each other as far as each one of these artists reconceptualize them. He doesn't use the word reconceptualizing, but reinvented them or interpreted them. It's a little bit, I believe what you're alluding to, Phyllis, and with Pepe's discussion about classicism as not being realistic.
I love that story about Rubens and Velázquez of the second, but this is not just about style. I think it's something fundamental to the way people function as artists. I remember when I was in high school, I took a life drawing class. Well, it was high school, so we were not drawing the nude figure, but different members of the class would take turns sitting in a chair with their clothes on, and everyone would draw portraits of them. And I remember one day walking around the circle, getting up my own easel and looking at everybody else's pictures. Each person's portrait of the model looked more like the person drawing it than it looked like the model.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
Thanks, Phyllis.
Thank you, Phyllis. And huge thanks again, Pepe and Joachim, for this great conversation. Everyone, please do go get the book. There's a link in the chat to it. We have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding our events with a poetry reading, and today I'm so thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Shin Yu Pai, to the stage. Shin Yu Pai is currently civic poet of the city of Seattle. She has written, performed, and published poetry for 25 years and is the author of 13 books, including most recently Less Desolate and No Neutral. She is host and creator of 10,000 Things, a podcast on Asian American stories for KUOW Radio. Shin Yu, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm gonna spend my time this morning just reading some poems that are inspired by visual art and artists. And this first piece is inspired by the painter Jackson Pollock. Number 14. Interlaced lines of black, silver, and white, moonlight woven dense as tree branches. The primordial visual field on Long Island Sound, seashells washed up on the seashore. Reordered by tides, no man before Pollock to turn a gaze downwards. Gardening pictures, rooting contact. Glimpses of white show through canvas. Light falling through slats in a barn roof. Patterns tessellate, reiterate, and repeat. A fractal dimension. Hurled, dripped, flung, and come. Full circle to galaxy and coastline. You designed no beginning, middle, end. When you said, I am nature. Equivalent. At an exhibition of Felix Gonzalez Torres, black and white clouds on paper lead to edge. The slow drift and pull of clouds soaring across the horizon. Weather forecast over Stieglitz's Lake George, overcast with breaking thunder showers. Poster sheets stacked half a foot high. The removal of cloud layers from cube reshaping the whole. What you touch, take with you, a piece of hard green candy pulled from a spill on the gallery floor, portrait of a friend, the qualities he gave those he loved, transposed into sweet pile. Please keep with you this sweetness passing. This next poem is called Discards, and I wrote it after viewing unpublished tintypes from the archive of Deborah Lester's project, One Big Self, which was a kind of hybrid photography project that she did with the poet C.D. Wright that was a study of the Louisiana prison industrial complex. Discards. An inmate shows off for the camera, gripping a prize Polaroid of a titty pic. Prisoners pose with hoe and rake, blower and broom intersect in St. Andrew's Cross, art historical sigils of civil wars, pest terminating apparatuses and displays of religiosity. Shirley's hand-tooled leather sandals, a Renaissance-style tableau, Christ's Last Supper, the convict clutching an ornamental 2-foot-tall wooden candy cane, marks the occasion. Happy holiday, happy Mardi Gras, happy Easter, happy Samhain, the ordained priest in clerical garb, regulation B-striped V-necked scrubs, exposed scars, burned in cicatrix, words scoring bodies, OG bump, lone outlaw, thug life, in memory of mom, cast off carte de visite, family photos that don't circulate, housed in storage under lock and key, dull blacks, tossed out whites, flattened tears of gray. And then I'll just read a couple of poems from a new collection called No Neutral, which came out in September. This piece is about a public art memorial that's located in Fort Worden, Fort Townsend. So it's kind of the remains of like a military kind of army bunker area. And the installation itself is a sculptural work created by a sculptor named Richard Turner, who made these giant poles or pillars that are planted in the ground and are engraved with the poetry of Sam Hamill. So it's a kind of large area which a visitor enters, and it's a space that really choreographs the actions of the people that visit it. Monuments for Men, Memories Vault, Fort Worden. I can't deny that beauty is here when bullied by design to turn my back to salt water and enthrone myself beneath the shelter to face a single pale stone enshrined within a slab mausoleum. The permanence of rock as persistent as the force of men. It's evident in the words etched onto stone steles, hostile architectures crafted by those who saw themselves like gods, who coerced the eyes upward to poles planted at the site. That old trope of man and his lover, the sea, patiently waiting for his return. I think, why not turn the gaze back to her right now, the sea? We have already seen enough of all that's man-made. This piece is about a series of artworks that I saw in Southern California that was part of the Desert X exhibition this spring outside of the Palm Springs, Palm Desert area. The curators of that show decided to install the work of Tyree Nichols on some billboards on the side of the road Tyree Nichols was a young Black emerging artist who was beaten to death by the Memphis police after a routine traffic stop. At the side of the road for Tyree Nichols, lining both sides of the highway roadside signs, my eye caught sight of the pictures the 29-year-old took down in Memphis, his adopted home, which he cared for by photographing. There was no way to slow down, go back, or park the car to process the information coming toward me in the back seat of the fast-moving car. I aimed my camera at billboards that blurred as I passed by. The removal of my eye filtered through a device, leaving me cold and distanced in the desert wind, like the wall between reading and sensing another news story, and recognizing at once his name and gaze, how different to feel into his likenesses, signposts, images of bridges, water, and stone markers shining at sunset. And this last poem that I'll read to you is about a very special place here in Seattle. There's a labyrinth outside the Museum of Pop Culture that was created by two artists, a sound artist, Trimpin, and a visual artist named Judith Caldwell. And it's a poem about exploring that labyrinth with a friend, with somebody I love. And I think the poem is very much about the idea that all poems, all poetry readings, all art is a kind of labyrinth, as is life. Coiling lines. It would be easier to travel outside the lines or cut directly through the field to cheat time instead of letting attention unfold at its own pace. At times, the switchbacks resemble a forking maze, the way some paths can lead to nowhere. These trails weren't drawn to be traveled side by side, but we walk them anyway, bumping into bands of tourists, gangs of families stuck fast in the web, their bodies the same as serpentine turns, put there to halt the mind that wants to think, I am doing this right, walking deeper into what was designed to reshape the perceptions, raise regard, to reawaken back to heart center. Thank you.
So beautiful. Thank you so much, Shin. That was truly wonderful. And thanks again, Joachim and Pepe, for the amazing conversation. It's been a pleasure to be in dialogue together this afternoon. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, as well as for supporting our archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. For the past 23 years, the Brooklyn Rail has been a platform for the arts, culture, and politics in our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Check the chat for a link to donate to support all of the work we do here at the Rail. And join us tomorrow in listening to the audio recording of These Little Oases, a symposium and poetry reading with the Network for New York School Studies, which was hosted by the Rail on October 28th, 2023. Register in our events page to get a link to the recording. And you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much again.
It was great.
Thank you. That was great. I really enjoyed it.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for tuning in, everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful reading.
Thank you, Eleanor.
I don't want to go.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pepe. Thanks, Joachim.